Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Data Science Daily Series. And just a reminder, we are in the Python Bootcamp series. Today, we will continue our discussion on functions and we will tackle a very important concept when we are thinking about functions and specifically variables and defining new variables. The concept is called variable scope, where we will find out the region of the code where that variable is accessible and it's defined, right? And here there are two main concepts that we will talk about. The first one is local variables, which are basically valid within the function itself. And then there are global variables, which are present in the entire code, right? But not necessarily inside functions. Let's understand this in a lot more detail. As a recap, we have started out with defining functions. We had discussed how to call functions, the different kind of arguments like keyword arguments, default arguments, and so on. And we also discussed about variable number of arguments in the last session. Today, the discussion is going to be about variable scope. So without any further ado, let's get started. As always, hope you have your Twitter notebook ready to run and you are able to follow along while writing similar code in your own Jupyter notebook. If you don't have it open, make sure you're opening it up. Make sure you're interacting with this session so that you're learning and getting the most out of this. All right, global versus local variables. So Python functions have mainly two scopes for variables. The first one is local variable scope, right? So local variables are variables that are defined within the function body, inside the function, and are only accessible within that function. These are created when the function is called, and these are destroyed when the function call finishes. So when you're defining a function, that's fine, right? You can define it as you want. But only when the function is getting called is the code within that function getting executed, right? So whatever errors you would see would only come when that code is getting executed. It will not come when the code or the function is getting defined itself. So that's why local variables are created when the function is getting called, and they're getting destroyed when the function call finishes, right? So they are only defined within the function body basically. And when the call happens, these are generated and then accordingly destroyed. Now, the second type of variables are global variables. These variables are defined outside of any function and are accessible throughout the entire program, right? However, it's generally recommended to avoid using global variables excessively, as they can make code harder to understand and maintain, right? So you have written down a lot of functions which perform certain actions and are written for a certain purpose. And you also, let's say, have a lot of global variables, right? That will make your code confusing to read for a new person who's coming in, who will try to understand what are these global variables doing and why are these actually defined when you actually have functions, right? So there can be cases where you need to define a global variable, but it's not always the case, right? So this is about a high level overview of global and local variables, but things will become only clear when we go deep into it. So let's get started with an example for local variables. Now, this example is a shopping cart example, right? Imagine a function add to cart item that takes an item as an input and adds it to a cart, basically, which is a local list inside that function, right? Let's see the example first. So I've defined a function add to cart, and there is one parameter which is called item, right? So add to cart item, and what this does, the docstring tells us that it adds an item to the cart and prints the current cart, right? So cart is defined as an empty list. This is a local variable. This only exists within the function, and it is created when the function is called. It then appends the item, right? Whatever is being passed in, whatever value is being passed in, and then it prints added item to your cart, and then it prints the current cart, right? So this is what happens. Now I run this. The function is now defined, right? No issues. Now I say add to cart apples. Now what the output should be is it will just be the list with one element called apples, right? Because cart is getting initialized as an empty list now. This new variable is getting initialized It is appending that new item, and then it is printing, and then the cart is getting destroyed after the function call finishes. So it will print current cart is apples, right? And now if I say add to cart bread in the next step, now it will not remember that apple has been added to the cart. Why? Because the cart variable is a local variable. It is defined only within the function. It's not a global variable. So this current function add to cart bread, when it is getting called, it doesn't understand that in the previous step the cart had already apples within it, right? So only what it will return is your current cart is bread, right? So this is why it is returning current cart is bread. The reason being, this cart is a local variable and it is getting initialized or created and destroyed within this function call itself, right? So let's do this. And how we can verify, if you try to print this cart variable, it will give you a name error that cart is not defined because it's a local variable. It's not defined outside that function, right? So this is just to demonstrate what are local variables, right? And this cart list is a local variable because it is only used and modified inside the specific function which is add to cart. All right. You can, as a side note, actually create a function which modifies the cart itself, right? And let's see how you would do that. So create a function that actually updates the cart. And can you think how you would do this, right? Add to cart new or version 1, right? Item, I will also put cart as an empty list here. And I will just say cart dot append item. I'll also try to return right? So now I say cart is equal to add to cart version 1 brackets apples, right? All right. So added apples to your cart, current cart is apples. Now if I say, right, cart is equal to add to this thing bread. Can you see what happens? Now when I say this, right, when I say cart is equal to add to cart version 1 bread, right, the current cart, it's actually basically having apples and bread, both of them, right? So what's actually happening? Can we decode this? The first thing that's happening is when you do this, let me define this again, right? So cart. Let's define cart as an empty list first, right? So your cart is an empty list. Now I say cart is equal to add to cart version 1 apples, and your cart becomes apples, right? Now when I say add to cart version 1 bread, what is happening, right? What exactly is happening? So what's happening is this cart, which is this list apples, it's basically getting passed in here, right? So if I print cart now, it is apples comma bread. So this cart variable, which you have actually gotten here, which is apples, is getting passed into this function automatically, right? Add to cart version 1 bread. And what this does is it adds this cart as a, it passes this into this function where it appends the item and then it prints it. And then it returns the new cart as well, right? So you can see that in this particular function, you are using the local variable, right? The local variable is cart, but it is also a global variable now when you're assigning this as an output to the function. So this is just an example as a side note. Let's move on to a better and more clearer example of global variables, right? So don't worry if you don't understand this currently. Let's move on to seeing how global variables actually work. The example here we will take is the game score example. Consider a simple game where a function increment score increases a player's score stored in a global variable score, right? So let's understand what is happening. So I've defined a score is equal to 0. This is a global variable accessible throughout the Jupyter notebook. Method 1, I want to increment the score, right? So I define increment score. So let me run this. Increment score as a function with no parameters, score plus equal to 1, because I want to increase the score by 1. Whenever this function is called, I want the score to be increased by 1, and then I want to print what is the current score. And I run this, right, as you would want to do when you're starting out. Now, if I run increment score function, it will not return score is 1. It will not increment score as 1. Why? Because score is a global variable, and inside this function call you have not firstly defined any kind of a parameter, right? So whenever you're referencing score plus equal to 1, right, it's saying score is equal to score plus 1, but score itself has not been defined, right? Because inside this local scope the variable score is not defined, and it is going and trying to reference that to the global variable, which is score, right? It's trying to reference to the global variable, which is score, and trying to change it. So you cannot change a global variable inside a function like this, right? So that's the reason why this is giving you an unbound local error, right? So very, very important concept here. You cannot change a global variable inside a function like this, right? Just by default, it will not work. Now, the third method, which is the correct approach, is you define the same function increment score, but here you need to define that the score variable has to be referenced or pointed to the global score variable, right? So I'm talking about the global score variable here, right? If you want to modify the global variable. And now if I do score is equal to score plus 1, it will work. And it will actually modify the score global score variable itself. So let's run this. Initially, you can see that your score was 0. Now, if you say increment score, you will get an output as score is 1. And if you see what the value of score global variable is, it will also become 1. So the global variable has been incremented by 1. If I again run increment score, score will become 2. And I will see that score variable also has become 2. And this is accessible outside the function itself, right? So this is a global variable because this is accessible outside the function and you're able to modify it within the function, right? By using this kind of a syntax where you're defining global score and that's it. And it understands that it needs to reference to the global score variable, right? One important note here is excessive use of global variables can make the code harder to understand and maintain. It's generally recommended to use local variables within functions and pass them as arguments whenever needed, right? So that's a very, very important note. Now, as a similar manner, what we did earlier, can we do one more approach, right? Let's see how that would work. Or let me define this as new, right? So what is the score right now? Score right now is 2. And if I say score is equal to increment, I also need to return the score. Increment score new. Score will become 3 and your score has also become 3. So this is another way to change it, right? What is happening here is the score is equal to score, right? It's basically taking in the global variable, the score as the global variable directly, right? I can also actually just say this. Okay, I cannot actually say that because I've not given any default values. You need to give a default value, right? Okay, so score is equal to score. What's happening is the initial score is 3 and you're incrementing it, right? So this score becomes plus 1, right? It prints that score is 3 and it is returning the score in which we are assigning to we are overwriting the original global variable, right? So this is another way to do it. You are overwriting the original global variable. So let's run this again. Let me define score as 0, just for clarity's sake. I run this function. Score is right now 0. I say score is equal to increment score new. So score value will take 1 and increment score new will print out 1, right? And let's say I do this one more time. The same thing will happen. Score will, okay. So score will become 2 now. And what is happening is I have to pass in that, the score that you need to consider is 1 now and increment it by 1. So it will become 2. All right. Now let's understand one more approach, which is the correct and easier and most clear approach, which is score is 0. You basically define different variable, right? So you don't change the global variable itself. You define a local variable, which is initial score, and you basically define a local variable called, let's make this new score is equal to initial score. New score is equal to new score plus 1 and return new score. Right? So we didn't run this. Right? So score is 1 first, score is 2 second, score is 3, and so on. And what we are doing here is we are calling the function, and basically we are passing in the previous output score here. So it's incrementing that every time. And this is very, very easy to understand. And the global variable does not change at all. Notice this, right? So because the score variable that we have defined inside the function, it's actually not defined here. But basically, this global variable is not going to change, right? So what I mean is, if I make this code here, right, and I run this code again, your global variable score will not change, because this score variable, local variable score, is created and destroyed within the function whenever it is called and when the call finishes. And the last method is again the correct approach, but with variable confusion, where you don't use a different variable name for the parameter. So you just use score and you say score plus equal to 1 and return score, right? So this will give you the same output, but it's slightly confusing basically. All right, so today we discussed about global and local variable scopes. I hope this is very, very clear to you. If not, make sure you're watching the video again. If you have any questions, putting them in the chat, and I will try to answer and get back to you as soon as humanly possible. And tomorrow we will discuss about Lambda functions, which are also called anonymous functions, in a lot of detail. So stay tuned. As always, hit the like, subscribe if you're liking this particular session and you want to stay tuned for new sessions on Python, machine learning, and so on in general data science. I will see you tomorrow. Good night.